hoc committee, and I guess will be recorded from here on out. But I'm going to turn this meeting over to Doug McLeod, who's going to carry us through a workshop for Tabor to bring us up to speed, and then he's going to have some assistance. So without further ado, Doug, why don't you take over?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. I'm Doug McLeod, Chief Financial Officer, and we do have a presentation to go through today. This is the Tabor Ad Hoc Committee, and I do want to introduce a few of the supporting cast from the last Tabor efforts that we looked at. Dee Weiser, who is an attorney with Butler Snow. Many of you know Dee Weiser already. He's done a lot of work for RTD in the past, as well as he's well known throughout Colorado, obviously, and elsewhere for his Tabor expertise. And he is part of our bond counsel team from Butler Snow and has helped us on many issuances and provide a lot of direction, has a vast history of knowledge regarding Tabor issues within the state, and has provided expert guidance in the past. So thank you, Dee, for joining us. Appreciate your help with this.
Glad to be here, Doug.
Great, thank you. And
go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Dee. And so we really just have a presentation to go through, several slides. A lot of what you'll see during this presentation is kind of a refresher of the slides that we've looked at in previous Tabor ad hoc committees. We had 2 to 3 Tabor ad hoc committee meetings in 2022, and the Tabor ad hoc committee decided to put that effort on hold until the new board members came on board and we could start fresh with the new year. So that's why we're meeting here today. And the purpose of the Tabor ad hoc committee is really look at some of the Tabor challenges that we face. Tabor being the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, it's a constitutional amendment for the state of Colorado that impacts governmental agencies. And it's really largely a policy decision-making effort that needs to be made on behalf of the board. And staff is here to support, provide information, as well as our experts such as Dee Weiser, provide information and guidance to the extent the board seeks that out, and hopefully result in some decisions that we can make to help mitigate the impact of some potential Tabor limitations to our revenue that will be forthcoming. So, Mr. Chair, without further ado, I'll just go ahead and jump into the presentation, if okay.
Okay.
Great, thank you. And let me do the share here, the presentation mode. Okay. So listed on here, Brendan Morgan, Senior Manager of Debt Investments. You're all familiar with Brendan. Brendan effectively acts as our Chief Investment Officer, very instrumental in helping us make decisions and providing guidance on our debt and investments, which Tabor certainly is a part of. But Brendan's joined as well to help field questions. I'm going to go through the slides myself.
Doug, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you're not on full screen mode. It looks like we can see your second screen.
Oh, gotcha. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, let me try this again. Apologies.
It's still your second screen.
Thank you. It's showing up on my other screen. Let me see here. Stop sharing. Tayshree, would you mind asking John to come over and help me, please?
Yeah, let me run down the hall.
Thank you.
Hi, Shrey, I can do that. He's next door to me.
So let me go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and begin talking about some of the subject items within this slide presentation. Hi, John. John, I'm trying to share my screen, and it's here. I go to full screen. All right. You just drag the whole thing over to that one. I got a share mode. Can you play with it?
So which one are you trying to?
This Tabor slide. Not sure. Yeah, it's not there. So we're gonna drag this over here. How do you drag that to that? How do you know? Oh, just got the top. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so Tai Shrey is going to run the PowerPoint. So be with you in just a second here. Great, thank you very much, Tai Shrey. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide for the overview. So these are subject areas we wanted to cover today. Again, these will be slides that many of you seen before with some slight updates, just as, again, as a refresher of what we've covered, what some of the considerations are and why we're here, and then next steps. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights was a 1992 amendment to the Colorado Constitution. And, you know, at a high level, basically what that requires is voter approval for all new taxes, tax increases, and new debt issuances. primarily bonds regarding RTD. Certificates of participation have been deemed to fall outside of Tabor because they're a lease purchase agreement. So we do have certificates of participation or COPs, but the main focus is bonds and borrowing money and paying it back with taxpayer dollars. Tabor also limits governmental revenue growth, collection. You've seen much in the news about several entities trying to debruce. I'll talk about that in a second, but essentially it limits the amount of, it's intended to limit the amount of government growth in terms of revenue collection and retainment of those revenues. There's also a provision that's known as the ratchet down effect. That ratchet down effect essentially resets the baseline. So under Tabor, the growth limitations are limited to certain growth provisions, depending on what type of government agency you are. Ratcheting down means that if your revenues drop in a certain year, that's your new baseline to set for the growth going into the following year that's limited. The term debrucing, many of you have heard of. Douglas Bruce was the author of this legislation or this constitutional amendment. And so the term debrucing refers to not being subject to certain or all of Tabor limitations. Currently, RTD is debruced, and we have two pieces to that. Really, the base system 6/10 sales tax and the 4/10 sales tax over on fast tracks. Next slide, please. So the 6/10 forecast is debruced through 2024, meaning it's not subject to Tabor growth limitations. It has and is still subject to debt issuance. So any additional debt issuance in terms of bonds would need voter approval. We are on the cusp as an agency, RTD, in paying off the remaining bonds that were authorized by the voters on the basis from 6/10 tax. And keep in mind that all of these bonds are sales tax bonds, so they're backstopped or they're supported and issued with the provision that sales and use taxes will be pledged to make those debt service payments. So
Doug, this is Bob Broom. I think we probably ought to take some questions as we go along rather than waiting until you complete, your entire presentation. So the question I had was what does the original bond question look like for these bonds, and how do you end up with having it terminate in 2024 and only being subject to being pushed out to 2026? What are the provisions that cause that?
Certainly, and I'll ask Dee or Brendan if they can. Brendan, did you want to go ahead and weigh in on that?
Sure. Dee could probably weigh in on some of the other aspects of that voter authorization, but the original debt that was issued by RTD related to this voter authorization, the final maturity of that debt was issued only out to 2024, even though the voters authorized the final maturities out to 2026. So we're essentially paying off the debt 2 years earlier than the voters had authorized way back when this senior debt, the 6/10 sales tax bonds were authorized.
Okay.
Yeah, and I could chime in that this was the November 2nd, 1999 ballot question related to the Southeast rail line construction. And in the question, it exempted RTD from Tabor's revenue and spending limits for the purposes of repaying the debt for the Southeast rail line, as well as operating that line. But then it had a sunset that said that exemption only exists so long as the bonds remain outstanding, but in no event beyond December 31, 2026.
Okay, that's answers my question. Thank you.
I have a follow-up to Director Brooms, and I apologize. I realized I was printing things while not on mute, so that was my background noise. So I just wanted to make sure I understood that for this particular question, we would not be under any obligation to go back to the voters if we decided to refinance these bonds based on what I just heard. And I understand that's not very common, but I also had a similar question to Director Broom is, what did the original language say, and was there anything so prescriptive that we needed to be aware of?
if I understand your question, you can always, under Tabor's provisions, refinance any outstanding debt so long as it's a lower rate of interest. So you don't
Okay.
need any voter approval for a debt service savings refunding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'll just pause at the end of each slide. If there are any questions, if that's okay.
Okay,
Great, sounds good. So that's the base system side. And so we're looking at 2024, possibly 2026. On the fast tracks portion, so that voter authorization occurred in 2004. And essentially that authorization authorized an additional RTD to be able to charge an additional 0.4% sales tax. And that was very prescriptive in the legislation or the ballot issue that was passed in terms of the amount that could be used. That 0.4 will partially sunset according to the need of RTD once the debt is paid off for the fast tracks bonds, according to the need remaining for RTD to continue to operate and maintain the fast track system elements. So that's in 2050 when the last bond is scheduled to be paid off on the fast track system. So there's that issue too. It's down the road quite a bit, but certainly something to consider in this overall policy context of possibly debrucing or other methods that we can use to mitigate the impacts of Tabor.
if that's the end of your discussion on this particular slide, going back up to the previous one, where do we stand right now in terms of interest rates? Interest rates have really been jumping up recently. And so to achieve the savings in interest rates, I wonder, are we in the ballpark or are we temporarily out of the ballpark as it pertains to the rate environment we find ourselves in today?
Brendan, please go ahead.
I'd be happy to. That's a good question, Director Broom. Interest rates, as you mentioned, are of course rising. These bonds, the 6/10 bonds that remain outstanding, we're currently paying coupons that are at 5.25%. Part of the challenge. So in theory, we could refinance these for slightly lower bonds today. However, they're not callable today. So we'd have to do this through a tender and be able to buy the bonds from one of the owners of the bonds today at a price that they'd be willing to sell it to us for, and then still make the entire transaction be economically end up such that we would actually be saving money through this effort if you wanted to refinance it.
The only saving grace is that the new debt would be so short, it'd be a lower rate typically. But with a inverted yield curve, I don't know what that looks like on the muni side anymore.
You're absolutely right. It'd be very short term. And the muni curve is also inverted on the short end of the yield curve, as you alluded to.
Okay, well, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And one other thing just noted there in the bottom, just to point out that the base system can use its funds to fund fast tracks, but the reverse is not true. Fast tracks cannot use its funding to support the base, with one notable exception in that in the original ballot language, it allowed for fast tracks to fund some limited bus service provided by the base under the assumption that the new elements that were built under fast tracks would require bus feeder service. So that was part of the plan, and that's kind of how we do things right now. We've been doing that since 2004, where we allocate a portion of the costs over to fast tracks from the base for bus system service. Otherwise, none of that funding can be used to subsidize the base system. Next slide, please. So when we talk about if nothing happens and we go into being subject to Tabor limitations after the 2024 assuming the last debt is paid off on the base system in 2024. 2025 would be the year that those revenue limitation growth parameters would come into effect. And we've got a quote here. If revenue from sources not excluded from fiscal year spending exceeds these limits in dollars for that fiscal year, the excess shall be refunded. So when we've gotten state Tabor refunds, it's the same situation essentially, where the state has collected more money than Tabor allows. That Tabor must be returned to the taxpayers. It's a little different situation for us from a geographic standpoint, and we can talk about strategies when it comes to that time about how that would the mechanics of how that would actually occur. But I think the focus of this group is really on the front end and how do we mitigate the Tabor strategies rather than focusing on how do we return money at this point.
I would agree with that.
Director Russo, please.
Thank you, Doug. I have a technical question and I'm almost embarrassed to ask because I should know the answer, but I just want to make sure in the event that we go back to voters on this issue, we are only the voters in the RTD district. This would the question would only be posed to those in the district, not statewide. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's only district voters, not statewide.
Okay, I thought so. I just wanted to make sure, and I know initially when RTD was created, it was a statewide question, and of course we have visitors coming into the district that also pay sales tax. So I wanted to make sure, and that would be for either question, correct?
For any financial
For
question.
any
related
financial
to the
question, it's
district.
always going to be okay. Just again, I was pretty sure I knew the answer, but I wanted to make sure.
Unless you'd like to run a constitutional amendment to exempt RTD from Tabor's provisions.
When I win the lottery, we'll chat.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I'm looking to Dee to keep and Melanie as well to keep me straight on the way I'm phrasing things in terms of the legalities of this. But essentially, the growth for RTD is limited to the sum year-over-year growth that we're allowed to keep in terms of our sales and use tax growth. And I believe it applies to all of our revenues in total, just year-over-year growth, all revenues. So we're talking a lot about sales and use tax revenues because we've historically talked about it making up 67% of the agency's revenue stream. In 2023, that's actually going to be 76% in the budget. And the reason being is because in the last few years, we've received COVID funding, which kind of ate up a bigger chunk of that pie. With that going away and with our fair revenue dropping a bit, now it's 3/4, sales and use tax is 3/4. So that's of our revenue sources. So that's really kind of the focus and why we talk so much about sales and use tax revenues, but we'll just need to keep in context, especially with the additional discussions about revenue diversification going on with the board. That big picture of total revenues are subject to this. Do you any comments on that portion? Okay, thank you. So the statewide, please go ahead.
If I may, and I it's been a while since I've looked at Tabor as it relates to RTD very specifically. So I'm going to be the new kid this afternoon, and I really appreciate your grace. But I did have a follow-up on that. And if it's cart before the horse, please tell me we can table this. Maybe it's later on in the discussion or a future meeting. For things like federal grant money or special projects, do we have the option to essentially create enterprise funds? So we don't. Go ahead.
Unfortunately for RTD, doing an enterprise would not work.
Okay.
But Tabor does, and I need to distinguish here, there are accounting enterprises and then there are Tabor enterprises, and they're similar but not identical. And under Tabor's enterprise language, it has to be a government-owned business that has its power to issue revenue bonds. And so you would say running the bus system or running the trains, that's a government-owned business. You certainly have the power to issue bonds, but then you can't receive more than 10% of your annual revenue in the form of grants from the state of Colorado or any local government. And that includes the district's revenues. And there is a court case, a Supreme Court case that involved another entity. It was RTD, but excuse me, not RTD. It was E470, and their E470 was suggesting it could have an enterprise, but the court said you E470 have the power to impose a sales tax, and even though you're not, that's inconsistent with being a government. Excuse me, inconsistent with being a business. That's more like a government, so you can't be an enterprise. So the short answer is no enterprises for RTD unless until somebody can figure out how to run a train for profit without a tax support.
Then we'd all be out of
Right.
jobs.
Yeah, right. There are, maybe this is an appropriate moment to touch on, there are exceptions from the fiscal year spending limit. And so, for example, federal funds are not counted against that. In gifts or donations, if you were so lucky to get those. And there's a list of other things, but really in your case, federal funds would be the big thing. And you can receive and spend as many federal funds as possible. They are not limited by Tabor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, it's for Director Deschel to go ask a question.
Sure.
Thank you so much. And just a quick follow-up. Is there an option or an opportunity to create an RTD subsidiary or something similar, which would be able to support itself? I'm thinking, from a revenue diversification standpoint, things like activating some of the spaces on train stations or parking lots, which we're allowed to do under new legislation, similar to how CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to my understanding, is an enterprise subsidiary effectively of Department of Natural Resources at the state level.
Yeah, it's just, as I mentioned, there is this Supreme Court case involving E470 that's troubling given the fact that RTD has the power to levy a sales tax. On the other hand, to your point, other governments, the state, city and county of Denver, for example, they certainly have tax sources, but they also have enterprises which are independent of those tax sources. I guess I'd want to think harder about whether that's something that RTD could do as to a discrete function, like say the paid parking. And we might need some legislation to allow that to happen. But that's a worthwhile conversation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Before I forget, I just got a card in the mail and the assessment on my house went up 49%. How does that impact how those numbers are going to be calculated for jurisdictions?
I think it has much of an impact. I don't think the value on your house, Bob, has much of an impact on the calculation of the Tabor formula. The local growth component of the Tabor formula is really about construction of new property or destruction of old property. And so since RTD doesn't levy a property tax, I don't think there's a direct impact there.
Okay.
Can I don't know how to raise my hand while I'm driving. Can I?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Director Broom. But I believe that I heard in relation to the last statement that Governor Polis intends to have some effect on Tabor based on property taxes. Is that not correct?
It is correct in part. Certainly, as I've read the press reports, in fact, I'm not sure whether anybody's seen the draft bill, or maybe it's been introduced today and I just haven't seen it. But the way I have read about it is they want to make these changes about assessment rates for various classes of property, and then they want to backfill the property tax loss to local governments associated with those adjustments, and they would use the Tabor refund that would otherwise be due taxpayers to fund that backfill. And so that's the Tabor interrelationship with the governor's property tax proposal. Again, not a direct impact on RTD since
No, but
RTD's.
I was
Yeah.
just thinking that it might set a precedent wherein Tabor refunds were not given in order to fund a public situation with property taxes. Perhaps it opens a door to Tabor refunds not being refunded in order to fund the public transportation service.
You know, for sure, that could happen in any legislative session. There have been past efforts to dedicate Tabor refunds to K-12, I think years ago, to highways. Maybe it was highways and mass transit together. Maybe somebody else on the call will remember that. But so far, the statewide voters have not seen fit to debruce the state other than through referendum C in whenever that was, 1999 or so.
But in terms of climate problems, they affect the entire state. So I'm just looking toward options in the future. That's all. Thanks.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Bob, I've had my hand up. I was,
Okay,
sorry. And I don't know if Director Ruscia still has a question, but her hand is up as well.
I do, but I'm gonna yield to Director Catlin.
Thank you. Going back to the base system, you said that we have no further debt capacity and that the bonds are scheduled to be paid off and that was from the Southeast Corridor bonds. Those are scheduled to be paid off in 2024, even though they were authorized to extend until 2026. What is the remaining debt service on those bonds? And if we were to be successful in debrucing for the base system, what would that get us?
Brendan, do you happen to have that outstanding principal?
Yeah, we currently owe $17.7 million of debt related to that 6/10 sales tax that's currently scheduled to be paid off by the end of next year.
So as a follow-up to that, the $17.7 million is pretty minimal compared to our overall budget and our overall debt. So to refinance that might not make a whole lot of sense for the effort. That's just maybe just an opinion. But I would like to know that if we were to debruce, would that open up additional debt capacity, or what would it gain us, I guess?
I believe that's dependent on, so the voters would have to give us approval to debruce, and it's dependent on the ballot language. And I think, you know, in order to increase our debt capacity, I think that would have to be part of the language and be specific to as to the debt that we'd be asking to, the debt capacity that we'd be asking to add.
Yeah, debrucing in and of itself wouldn't allow any additional debt to be issued. And of course, you could always do additional COP transactions and use the debruced revenues to make payments on those.
Okay,
But
that
if you
answers
also,
my question. Okay,
okay, thanks, Peggy.
thank you. So there is some flexibility there, but if we were to want to issue any additional debt to perhaps maybe fund additional new buses, for example, or anything like that, then we would have to go to the voters specifically for that question.
Well, we could go to the voters with a question for sales tax revenue bonds for mass transit writ large, or some more targeted effort there. But Peggy, as I think you well know, the district at least traditionally has funded rolling stock through COP
Right.
transactions that don't need voter approval, and just used sales tax revenues after paying debt service on sales tax bonds to make those payments.
But those COPs are limited at this point. I was looking at something a little larger scale. But those sales and use tax, those bonds were used for capital construction on the T-Rex project for the most part, right?
The 1999 authorization, yeah. Mhm.
Right, okay. I was just seeing what kind of flexibility we might have.
Well, and if the district wanted to eventually go back to the voters and ask a sales tax debt question, you could do that and probably combine that with a debrucing concept. They're political questions there, they're above my pay grade, but
Yeah, I would think that just to go to ask a plain vanilla debrucing question, shall RTD be allowed to, to debruce or whatever the language would be, that's never going to fly, because it has to be combined with something that the voters out there would want. So you might have to have some kind of a question saying, does the voters want to go to zero emission vehicles, blah, blah, blah. And in order to accomplish this, would you allow us to to debruce or something along those lines? But it's going to have to be a combined question, just like these current exceptions that we got. They were combined with other questions for services, to be provided to the public. But,
good point, Bob. I think a lot of the governments who've done debrucing have they've targeted the debruced revenues to specific purposes or activities. But there are also a lot of governments that have just very broad debrucing questions that allow them to spend the money on pretty broad topics. But you're right, it's about how you can persuade the voters to vote for this.
So, this is further on down the line, obviously, but if we were to have a consultant do some questioning to voters about, what works for them, then we could maybe come up with a program that what works for RTD plus what works for the voters, and then it's a win-win situation and you might have a chance. But just to go out and ask a pure debrucing question, people are going to say, what's in it for me? I'd rather get another check in the mail like I get from the state of Colorado.
Bob, thank you for saying that, because that's kind of what I was alluding to by my question. So I appreciate it.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and complete the presentation, and then we'll talk about where we're going to go from here.
Mr. Chair, Director Rusha does have her hand raised.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. I think actually Director Catlin essentially asked the question I was going to ask, is that even if we were to move forward and refinance, what revenue are we looking at, like, relative to our budget, and if it was worth it. But I also wanted to go back, and I had a clarifying question following Director Deschelle's comment about alternative revenue streams, and also revenues that are, for lack of a better word, protected from Tabor. When we rent for real property that we rent, is that revenue also subject to Tabor restrictions? This is like a real hypothetical. I don't want to get the weeds, but is that a potential avenue as well? Developing any property that that might result in real dollars for the district that we could use for mass transportation.
In terms of renting property as opposed to selling property, sales of property, if you get proceeds from selling property, those are exempt from Tabor's limitations. But rental income would otherwise be subject to Tabor's limitations unless the activity is again an enterprise. It would have to be this government-owned business authorized to issue its own revenue bonds that doesn't receive more than 10% of its revenues from state or local grants. So I think it's, in my view, the answer is kind of the same as with respect to maybe parking. We'd have to
Okay.
think about that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. So again, the ratchet down. So one thing I wanted to speak about a little bit in relation to this is, so even while we're debruced, so I'll give an example. Back in 2009, 2010, when we went through the last Great Recession, which was last negative impact, sizable negative impact to our sales and use taxes here at RTD. We did have a 4% decrease during COVID during 1 year, and then it subsequently rebounded 19.8% in 2021, followed by another 13% in 2022. Both those cases, both those years certainly were higher than the limits that we would be subject to had we not been debruced in terms of growth. So back in 2008, 2009, we went through the Great Recession. RTD sales and use taxes declined by 10% during that period. So had we been debruced at that point in time, our new baseline would be that low point for the next year's revenue growth limitation measurement. So it basically ratchets down the agency to that new level. So you cannot return back to the level you're at pre-recession, for instance, unless it's over a period of time and falls within those growth limitations. So some of the things we've talked about with our midterm financial plan, looking out 6 years, and as well as the Reimagine plan, is the impact that Tabor limitations could have to this agency. It's really hard to guesstimate because there's a whole range of different scenarios, but suffice it to say, any decrease in our total revenues in 1 year is going to reset that baseline, ratchet us down to a new baseline to measure for the period going forward for the next annual evaluation. Next slide, please. So one of the slides that we had presented at a prior Tabor ad hoc committee was just give an example of what that would look like. So if those Tabor revenue limitations had been in place in, say, 2007, before the Great Recession, and we just assumed a 1.4%, this is based on a study done by through WSP, who was one of the consultants on the Reimagine process. They had a property tax or a property consultant and a real estate consultant also helping them out. And they ran a scenario of what would happen if we look back in time, what was the average growth in that RTD would have been subject to had it been subject to Tabor, and it averaged about 1.4% growth, I believe, in the property tax side. So what's shown here is the blue line indicates what our actual results were in terms of recovering from that recession. The orange line represents where we would have been had we been subject to Tabor revenue growth limitations. And again, this is just for the base system. So we're talking about 60% of our sales and use tax revenues has that large of an impact. So over a 12-year period, that amounted to $648 million approximately that we actually did get, that we would have had to return to taxpayers had Tabor limitations been in place. Next slide, please. So just a quick recap of the prior Tabor ad hoc committee meetings that were held. The first one was held on April 11th, 2022. Went through sort of the same process, same information and discussion about some of the limitations and issues that we face. And then it was followed up with a subsequent meeting on June 13th, where staff and D. Weiser and others had gone and looked at, what are some potential recommendations we could bring forth to the Tabor ad hoc committee of a path to take going forward. At that point in time, there were lots of discussions, lots of brainstorming. And again, what was decided at that point in time was to hold off until the election was over in November and we got into this new fiscal year and could really reset and take up this issue again. Next slide, please. So from our perspective, from just strictly financial perspective, here's the concerns that we have. Tabor will reduce our revenues at some point. So it's historically, we haven't been able to do a really good comparison year over year of what that would look like in real results. But historically over the last 10, 15 years, our sales tax growth has been quite substantial. In fact, you may remember from the previous slide, we were in the $300 million range just about 10 or 12 years ago in terms of sales and use tax collections. We're now in the $800 million range. So at some point in time, our growth would be limited, supposing that Tabor revenue limitations come into play. They'd be limited to growth less than what we actually collected, and possibly even worse, we could get ratcheted down. So here are some of the ideas that have been kicked out around. Dee has mentioned some of the limitations in terms of what we can and can't do under our enabling legislation and statutes. So obviously we've talked quite a bit about possibly debrucing, which would require going back to the voters to get authority to do that. There was some discussion about combining the 6/10 and 4/10 at the same time. So there's obviously different structures of how that could be worded. That was to combine the 6/10 and 4/10 was kind of put on the back burner during the discussion. It was more for a simplification of administrative issues and this whole notion of not being able to use the 4/10 on the 6/10 and vice versa, and heading towards the concept of one RTD. It's more on the accounting side and funding side, I would say. So that was kind of lesser of a concern for this committee previously. And then of course, diversifying revenue sources. And what that would do is it wouldn't mitigate necessarily the impacts of Tabor, but it could to a certain extent because of the ratchet down effect. If our revenues, the economy dropped and the sales and use tax collections have historically followed economic conditions. So when we had a recession, sales and use taxes went down because our constituents within the districts spent less money. So by diversifying that revenue base potentially to something that's less economically sensitive to those types of swings, we could possibly avoid some of the impacts of an economic downturn because our revenues would be a little more steady and we'd avoid possibly that growth. So that's part of the discussion, plus just the overall risk to the agency, Tabor aside, of diversifying our revenue sources so we're not dependent on 3/4 of our revenue coming from one source. Another item that was also discussed is possibly modifying our fiscal policy to mitigate Tabor impacts. Again, that's more of a short-term solution, simply because right now we have in place a 3-month fiscal policy that requires retainment of 3 months worth of reserves, operating costs replacement. In the event we hit a downturn, it was deemed that 2 to 3 months. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends 2 months. The board previously, several years back, said 3 months would be a little more conservative, make them feel better. So we keep 3 months worth of operating expenses in reserve in case our sales and use tax revenues drop significantly. We can still maintain operations and buy some more time to make some adjustments to expenditures. By the way, we don't have too many levers that we can control as an agency in terms of our revenues and expenditures, or our revenue side, excuse me. The expenditure side is usually where we look when we need to make adjustments to balance our budget. So we can't do much with our debt service. We can restructure that in the event it was things got really bad. We could restructure that to change years and change cash flows potentially. But the rest of the expenditures, what we've typically done is eliminated that low-hanging fruit certainly first, things such as travel and employee development, those types of easy things, but those are on a relatively small scale. So when we're talking about significant changes in our revenue structure to the negative, we often look to service reductions. So again, that's really our reserve policy, is really to try to maintain that. And under Tabor, if it ratchets us down or we lose that growth that's been projected, it may carry us, the reserves may carry us for a period of time, but once we've spent that down, we're left with nothing else. We would need to replenish those or adjust expenditures down. Next slide, please. So some of the Tabor options that were suggested for the base system: number one, do nothing and just try to manage under the Tabor regime going forward. Or voter approval would be needed for the following options, and we've already discussed each one of these to a certain extent. So we're left with limited options on what we can do. Probably, I think the one that was identified as the most impactful in terms of benefits for RTD would be to get voter approval to change our us being subject to Tabor. Next slide, please. So at the final meeting that we had last year for the Tabor Ad Hoc Committee on June 13th, where we left off, we had some action items to take away, and those are listed here. So we wanted to, we've already talked a little bit about extending the debrucing term for the base system from 2024 to 2026. Brendan mentioned, and we've talked to our financial advisor Hilltop about this, and would need to dig into this more, but would need direction from the board. Since this is a policy decision, if we move forward with that, we can continue to look at what our options are. Obviously, as Dee says, we need to show that there were savings involved, and it involves a special type of refinancing. Excuse me, I've got a cold, but Brendan mentions there's over $17 million in principal to be paid off, that will be paid off in 2024. Our understanding and just our cursory research was that we would just need to refinance one of those bonds. And I do believe, Brendan, most of the par values of those bonds are $5,000 per bond approximately.
Doug, I apologize. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'm not sure if they were serial bonds or a term bond or what was out there, but yeah, we would just need one bond essentially. We wouldn't have to do the full 17 million or anything like that.
Thank you. Perfect.
Oh, excuse me, Doug. So what you're saying is that refinancing it is buying time. It's not, okay, that makes sense.
Correct. And we can go into a little more detail, perhaps with Dee's knowledge of, the time it takes and which election cycles are most beneficial, if that's the route that the agency chooses to take. Obviously, it takes a substantial bit of time to put a plan like that together. So that was the idea behind extending it. Plus the fact from a financial perspective that there's been a lot of talk. I just saw a report the other day that 70%, I think it was, of economists expect a recession to happen within the next year. And so the timing of that would be, really bad because for RTD, because that would be right when we start to go into that final year, 2024. We could get ratcheted down in 2024 due to a recession. And then, we're already starting from a really disadvantaged point going forward. Dee, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think thinking about the politics behind an election and when's the best time to go, I think, if you had a political consultant on this call, they'd suggest you'd want to be on the 24 ballot because that's a presidential election year, and high voter turnout usually is better for financial elections than low voter turnout. On the flip side, there'll probably be lots of other things on the ballot in 2024. And as an aside, I think we talked about this at one committee meeting. Under the Secretary of State's ballot numbering rules and ordering rules, RTD's debrucing question would be the last Tabor question on the ballot, the way the rules currently work.
I guess, from my viewpoint, I think we should probably be prepared to move forward with that small refinancing just to buy an extra 2 years. And you don't have to go forward with it. You can always pull it, but get it ready to go. From a practical standpoint. But that other discussion about hiring, a political consultant, I think that's something that probably needs to be done, and probably the executive committee or the finance committee should take that up pretty quickly and get somebody on board. And that'd be my recommendation, but we're not going to be voting on that anyway. So, but the minutes will reflect that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Rusha?
Thank you. And also, to add to that, the board doesn't have an official position on debrucing. We're just in the conversation stage. So I wonder if procedurally we will have to take a position, or at least take a position to give direction on either of these questions at our next meeting. And Melanie would be the expert on that procedural question. But I think what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm the new kid, but what I'm hearing is that if we refinance one bond, it is, relative to our budget and debt load, a small amount of money. And it seems like even if we diversify some of our revenue streams, nothing stands out in a big way. I also don't see this board levying property tax, even though we can. I think voters would riot. And what I'm hearing really is that we need to go back to the voters and ask them to debruce. And with that, I would just say that however it needs to happen, the board needs to make a decision or come to a more formal agreement on what our position is, because next, November of 2024 is around the corner. And I think that we would have a lot of work to do with the public, I think, to earn that trust to be successful in that kind of ballot initiative.
I guess the scary part of this is what Doug mentioned earlier, that the revenue stream is 70% is that 1% sales tax. So, I mean, the Tabor thing really impacts RTD harder than it does any other jurisdiction that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm sure there are some that are in the same boat, but for the most part, most people have multiple revenue sources, and that's by design in many cases. The other thing that needs to be looked at, obviously, with and soon is this question of how do you expand your revenue base, and it seems like fees are the things that everybody's doing these days to get around the ballot, and Tabor elections. And so we should be looking at doing, coming up with some type of a fee for mass transit in the area. And maybe it's a combination of things. The state highway department's got problems, maintaining their highway system. Cities have problems maintaining, their roads. Maybe a transportation fee that covers everybody and that's apportioned out is something that has to be looked at as a way of doing this. And for a future meeting, I'd like to ask our staff to, as I understand it, Colorado Springs passed a transportation fee, and that it was taken to the Supreme Court, and it was at that point was approved, but then the city council got cold feet and they didn't go ahead and impose the fee. So I'd like some research on that, and we can discuss that at one of our future meetings. Does anybody else have anything else to bring up for the good of the meeting that's going on 2 o'clock now?
I do, Director Broom.
Okay,
I remember both the 1999 question as well as the 2004 question. I also remember the, and Dee, you'll remember this, our favorite 22-year-old stadium. We had to go to a vote of the people for that. And I remember all three of those campaigns costing quite a bit of money. So I think that, excuse me, I think that needs to be part of the equation. What are we willing to put out for, and what are the risks associated with the election? So I just, if I might suggest, Director Broom, that we also include that information for subsequent meetings.
okay.
Mr. Chair, I also, I think this question is for Mr. McLeod, and I don't want to give a lot of homework or go down a rabbit hole, but it might be useful for us if in our next meeting, if you could present, even just in bullets, potential alternative revenue streams that we could look to that we currently have statutory authority to do. And if there are any things that, any other measures that you are aware of that might just need a change to the RTD Act, maybe note those as well. The board has brought up alternative revenue streams a lot in the last couple of months, and I think just getting a little bit of direction of what's possible, and even though it's hypothetical, general idea of what kind of revenue that might bring in would be helpful for us as well. But I kind of yield to Director Broom as far as the agenda for the next meeting, if you think that would be helpful.
Okay, I guess under next steps, we got to come up with a future meeting schedule in cadence, I guess. Do we want to do this monthly, or what's staff thought? How much time do you need to get ready for another meeting and research some of the questions that we brought up during the course of this meeting?
I would look to the rest of the staff as well as General Manager Johnson for their preference. Some of these are pretty easy. We're going to have a discussion on the May 9th, I believe it's May 9th, the next Finance and Planning Committee, about some revenue diversification items that were discussed during the board retreat. So there will be an opportunity there, and we are kind of limited in terms of what we've been able to identify, and the sizing of it's usually fairly typically immaterial to the big picture of things, but we can certainly discuss those, Director Rush, at the next Tabor ad hoc, certainly, and bring that forward. That shouldn't take long to put together. So I think most of these things we could probably have together in the next month or so, given that I guess the other thing we probably really want to investigate more closely is the refinancing of the bonds too, to push that out 2 years. And we can, I think, be prepared to come back with what that looks like, if it's possible, and if it meets the criteria for saving money within the next month. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brendan, do you think that's doable?
Yes, I think that's a reasonable amount of time. The question we will be stuck with not being able to answer would be, is it, we can cover the hurdle, we can come to a conclusion whether or not our legal counsel tells us we can legally do it. Our financial advisors will tell us whether or not we can theoretically do it. The question will just be whether or not we can actually do it, in the market that is available to us at some point in the near, not too distant future, as things are always evolving. Things can change, but we can certainly come up with a fairly solid stance, I think, by then.
Yeah, I think one thing was kind of confusing when you talked about doing one bond. I think you were talking about doing one $5,000 bond that was part of the two different issues that are outstanding. Isn't that correct? And not doing one full maturity year or something?
That's right. Yes. This transaction will likely not generate much economic benefit to RTD or any savings, as Dee alluded to. So we're going to have to figure out how to do it.
Well,
we'll do it as small as we can.
The legal expenses and so forth would eat up anything if you're only doing 5,000.
Yes, we're going to have to be very creative. You're right.
Hopefully this isn't stepping out of my lane, but I do think there's sort of an optics issue here for you. Because it's not a refunding you would otherwise plan to do, but for this debrucing. And so there might be some public critique of that.
That's true. And I guess the answer is well, it buys the district 2 more years. It's like an insurance policy for 2 more years that you're not going to be subject, to this ratcheting and all this other stuff.
And I hate to sound negative, particularly on the record, but I'm almost wondering if it's like a Band-Aid on a hole of a sinking ship because it is a small amount of money. You know, I'm of the opinion that we need to go to the voters to debruce. And, you know, we might have a public relations problem. It's up to the board to help fix that. And to work on voter trust. I think fast tracks is the elephant in the room. But I'm one of 15, but for me personally, as a director, I would feel more comfortable if we could get that question before the board so we can take an official policy position. You know, we don't know if we can count to 8. I think we could, but really, if we move forward with this, with debrucing, then we need to have a unified voice, and we need to talk about what that means and what we can reasonably promise voters, what we're going to do with those funds. I think, as Director Broom has pointed out, and also Director Williams, you know, these measures can be more successful when they're tied to projects that the public is interested in, or policy. Although, as Diaz pointed out, even, you know, education debrucing measures have failed statewide. So it's a tall order. It will take the best of the best, and it also really truly requires this board to be on board with debrucing. And I think if that's even a possibility, we just need to start having those conversations, those public conversations like this one right now, and get on it as soon as possible. And I'm also a recovering political consultant for its worth. That's my 2 cents, and I'll yield so we can adjourn.
Okay, well, obviously, this committee, which has only 2 members, we're not going to come up with a, you know, ironclad proposal or anything like that. I think all we're going to do is accumulate some information, pass this thing on to the finance committee, and they're going to have to be the ones that flesh it out and decide, you know, are we going to hire a political consultant, and what's the calendar going to look like? And I would agree that the presidential year is the year you need to shoot for, because you're going to have a better voter turnout for particularly something like public transportation. So,
yeah.
Does anybody else have any other matters to bring before us before we adjourn?
Mr. Chair, if I'd like.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, this is Doug McLeod. Just wanted to make sure that you would be okay with me working with the board office to coordinate with this committee and the finance committee on a path forward in terms of follow-up meetings.
Yes.
Thank you.
So that means within about a week or 10 days, we should know when our next meeting is going to be?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Well, unless there's anybody else, I see one other hand up here. Mr. Guzman.
I just want to seek clarification on something because I haven't heard it before. There was a reference to the initial COP. Was that referring to certificate of participation?
Yes, sorry for using the acronym, but yes, that's what it is.
Great, thank you. That's all I needed to know.
Okay, anybody else? Well, thank you very much. I think this was interesting, and it's a tall order, obviously, to deal with this. And I appreciate your time this afternoon, and we'll see you at the next meeting. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.